Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, and it is now a course at NYU and an elective towards the journalism certificate. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. And follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. And I am so excited to have Maggie Smith with us today. And we're going to talk more about these 2 beautiful books that she has written recently. And I want to tell you a little bit about Maggie. She's the New York Times bestselling author of 7 books of poetry and prose, including You Could Make This Place Beautiful, Good Bones, Goldenrod, Lamp of the Body, The Well Speaks of Its Own Poison, and Keep Moving, Notes on Loss, Creativity, and Change. Her newest book is My Thoughts Have Wings, a picture book for children, illustrated by Leanne Hatch. Smith's poems and essays have appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Paris Review, Time, The Nation, The Atlantic, and the Best American Poetry. She lives with her 2 children in Columbus, Ohio, and I believe she also has a pushcart prize, even though it wasn't in her bio. So welcome to the program, Maggie. It is so great to be speaking with you, and we'll talk a little bit about how we got connected, but I also want to hold up both your books. They look so nice together.
They do. It's so good to be here. Thanks for having me. I know it's funny looking at them side by side like that, which I don't do often. I'm realizing that they coordinate. There's, the sort of green leafiness and the pink flowers, and that's a complete happenstance. And I love when that happens.
That is beautiful. And that is a very poetic and visual way to look at the world, to see that. I love that. So we have so much to talk about. So first of all, let's talk about My Thoughts Have Wings, because it's a pretty book. And it also has that thread of metaphor, of birds, of wings. You mentioned nest, you mentioned flutter. I'm an editor. I pay attention to words. And so I see that this theme, this metaphor, is just so strong throughout. These thoughts flutter and flap in my head. And it isn't just that you talk about the thoughts have wings and it's like you're bringing in birds into the page. So talk to me how the book came about, because I like to talk about structure, like your part structuring it with the illustrator.
Yeah, this is my first truly collaborative book experience. So much of writing is fairly solitary until you get to the editing stage, and then there is that someone else rolling up their sleeves and getting into your sentences. But this is really the first book where I made my part, handed it off, and then someone else took it and ran with it, sort of like a relay race. The book was inspired by conversations with my kids. So it's maybe also the first collaborative book and the first book that is truly the sort of meeting of my parenting life and my writing life in a really direct way. So I had had a conversation with my daughter Violet when she was small. She's in high school now, so this was many years ago. And she was having a hard time sort of turning her brain off at night, which I think many of us do. We tend to sort of ruminate in the evenings when things get quiet. And because I'm a poet, which perhaps having a mother who's a poet is sort of a blessing and a curse, but because I'm a poet, the metaphor came to me, thoughts are like birds. And that's what I told her in that moment, lying in bed with her. Thoughts are like birds, and some of them fly away really quickly, and some of them make nests in our heads. And that's okay. Like, your head is such a beautiful place to live that no thought wants to leave. Like, I don't want to leave you either. So I actually completely understand why your thoughts would want to stick around. And I don't know what it was, but something about that metaphor comforted her in that moment. Maybe just feeling like, oh, this is normal. Like, sometimes this is just what happens. There's nothing wrong with me that my mind is hanging on to certain thoughts. And then fast forward to 2020, 2021, and my son at the time was first, second grade. And between the divorce and the pandemic, he was having a really difficult time going to sleep at night. And so I recalled that metaphor for him and repurposed it, and then pushed it a little bit further and said, okay, how can we make room for more positive thoughts? If you're having trouble with negative thoughts at night, how can we make space for positive thoughts? How can we help them build nests in your head? And so we came up with this bedtime ritual of listing things to look forward to, happy memories, funny things that happened that day, things that we were going to do that coming weekend, whatever the case may be. And it really helped calm him down. And it gave us a really peaceful way to connect and even laugh during a really tough time. And that's when the spark was born for the book. Like, what if I can make something that would enable other families to have these kinds of conversations? Because I know my kid is not the only one, particularly right now during lockdown, having trouble going to sleep.
This was your first picture book. So you told your agent or your editor, or you were like, I have an idea,
Yeah.
and they said, go with it. I mean,
Yeah.
because what's so interesting, a lot of people want to do picture books, but they think like, ABC or just very service. And because you're a poet and you're a master of form, you figured out a container for this book that works. One of my favorite books is The Situation and the Story by Vivian Gornick. And she talks about the exterior, which is the situation, as you know. And that's just, this happened, that happened. But then there's that internal structure. And so you are so adept with form as a poet. I think that's really a strength, a gift that you could then go on that deeper level. And that's what this book achieves. That's why you're the first picture book that I'm featuring on the program.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's in some ways it's nonfiction, because this is a conversation I have had with an actual human being in my life. And it's been interesting. I sent the manuscript in. We worked on finding an illustrator together, my editor and I. She said yes, received the manuscript, and then I just had to kind of wait for those initial pencil drawings to come in to kind of see what direction she was taking things. And it was so exciting to sit down with my son in particular and have him see his actual memories and worries illustrated
Wow.
by an artist. If I had done it, it would have been stick people. So that was, I mean, that was particularly exciting, I think, for both of us. Is when most of us don't have the opportunity to have things that are in our minds illustrated professionally. And so for him, he calls this our book, which I think is really sweet. And it is. It's another way of this happening via collaboration, which is it was the two of us collaborating to make the material for the book.
That's really nice. So it's collaboration on many forms. It's with your son, it's with the illustrator, it's branching out into a new area for you in terms of, I guess, readership.
Yeah. I mean, and that was exciting, and it really did come down, I think, like you were saying, to form and finding the framework. Once I have the framework for a thing, I feel like I can be off and running. But when I just have an idea and I don't know the shape or even genre necessarily that it will take, it's just waiting really for me to come along to that framework.
I want to excavate that a little bit more. So there are a lot of writers, they struggle with framework, with structure, with setting up in a certain way, even in regular consumer nonfiction writing, which is my expertise, how to do that container, set it up as a report card, set it up as the best, worst, greatest. Since you're so adept at that, how do you get to that point? Do you make lists? Are you a
Mhm.
plotter? Are you a pantser? Is there a list of forms that you have that you go through and check it out? Like, because I think your process would be so valuable to hear how you do that.
Yeah, I'm not someone texted me the other day and said, I'm working with somebody on a book proposal for a memoir, and we're wondering if you outlined your memoir. And I was like, I've never outlined anything, probably since high school when I had to write 5-paragraph essays. So it's, for me, pretty intuitive, and I always start writing before I know what I'm doing. So I just write, and then I look at the material, and typically the shape will start to kind of bubble up from what I've written, and then I have to kind of take that, try it out, write it again, see if that framework works. If it doesn't grab me, I try another way in. I'm often thinking about sort of what is the welcome mat or the door into a piece of writing, whether it's a poem or a picture book or a memoir or an essay. Like, what is the reader's entryway in? Because I want that to be dynamic. I don't want them to get bored in the first 3 paragraphs and then realize it picks up later. And then what is the exit? Like, what's the exit strategy? Where do I want to leave the reader? What do I want left unsaid, maybe, so that they can kind of continue to chew on something in their own minds when it's over? And so I'm thinking a lot about what's the way in and what's the way out. And looking at all the material that I've drafted, usually I can find a good welcome mat and a good way to kind of step out. And then the rest of it is okay, then what happens in between?
Maggie, when you say welcome mat, do you mean like an inciting incident or a compelling bit of dialogue or something that happens? Is that what you're referring to?
I mean, literally, what's the title in like the first sentence or the first line? Like, what is the reader encountering first? What are you offering them at the doorstep that's going to make them want to come in and find their way around the rest of it? And often when I'm teaching, I realize I'll look at a student's poem or essay and I'll think, actually, this really doesn't pick up and grab me until stanza 3 or paragraph 2 or sentence 4. So I think we all tend to, as we draft, find our way into a piece. And sometimes we're kind of revving our engines for a while at the beginning and kind of finding our momentum. And a lot of times, what I find is we begin we have a little bit too much preamble that's not that interesting to the reader, and then we overstay our welcome if we're not careful and
Yes.
kind of shoot past the target and go on a little too long at the end, where ending a little bit sooner and giving them a little bit more agency to sit with something instead of handing it all to them at the end. Like, those are the things I'm thinking about, and that probably comes mostly from a being from a poetry background rather than from a, say, narrative writing
Yeah,
background.
because poems, most poems, and I'm not as familiar with poetry, but most poems are short, right? They're short. You get in and you get out. And so, even like the first page of My Thoughts Have Wings, you start with sometimes when I go to bed, my body is calm and still, but my mind feels busy and loud. So, what you're doing is you're using a tactic that I talk to my students about this a lot, is you're using the last word of the sentence to lead into the next part. So this is a strategic choice that you make, Maggie. And so, but my mind feels busy and loud. The next part is going to talk about the loudness of the mind. So that's your entryway, that's your ramp. And I think that a lot of people don't realize there is thought behind, especially with a poet, you have to think of every word counting.
In that first sentence. That's
Yes,
that's also the whole conflict is handed to you in the first sentence.
that is so important. So it's setting up the conflict, it's setting up the whole theme of it. And then you're going to get into those loud thoughts, and boom, it goes into that. And then you're going to get to the part, and then there are questions. I mean, this whole book maybe is what, 500 words?
Maybe, if
Maybe.
that. Yeah.
But each word is so important. And the ending, the happy thoughts gather twigs and bits of soft green moss for their nests. Now I'm smiling in the dark too.
There's a sort of mirror pattern that's happening where earlier in the book, the child can hear the mother smiling in the dark as she talks to the child. And so by the end of the book, we kind of get that full circle moment where there's that comfort of now I'm smiling in the dark too, because the quiet, the loud negative thoughts are no longer taking up space. And so that even the use of extended metaphor and kind of what I would call book ending, like setting up something early in a piece and then coming back around to that to give the reader that sense of closure. Now I'm smiling in the dark too isn't, and then they lived happily ever after. We don't really know what's going to happen next, right? It doesn't completely seal up the story. It's left a little bit ajar, but I think it leaves us feeling sort of, there's a sense of comfort and closure in that.
This must have been really fulfilling for you to write because of all the connections, and also it's sort of like a long poem for a child.
Yeah, it kind of is. It was really fulfilling to work on, and a nice project coming off of the memoir too, which was a really fulfilling project, but also very heavy in ways that this project was not. And so it felt like a breath of fresh air.
So I want to talk about the memoir. And so when I was at AWP, I was on a parenting panel, and I went to your panel and you talked about women who lead. And I was fascinated. I've been in a marriage for 19 years and my husband is very supportive. But when I first had my daughter, I was somebody who was a professional woman. I was a magazine editor for many years. I launched magazines, I ran things and wrote for everybody back when print was king. It was a transition, having the least amount of power I think I've ever felt I had in my life, having a baby. And my husband going to be the breadwinner, and I was doing some freelance from home, but it was like, is this all it is? I loved being a mother. I was a mother in midlife. My daughter's 14 now, so I was in my 40s when I had her. I was in my 40s when I got married. And so I feel like I didn't know who I was anymore. I couldn't identify the way I did. I got involved with a group called Mothers and More. They're now defunct, but what they said changed my life. And it said the invisible work that mothers do, which is the cooking, the cleaning, the chauffeuring, the making appointments, has value. I took that in. And as I felt the patriarchy in my marriage start to arise, I would say to my husband, I'm doing invisible work and this has value. I never purported to be a domestic goddess, so I at least had that. But I said that and I owned it. And I do believe it saved me. So reading your book, I really felt for you. You started out in a situation where your ex-husband perhaps wanted to be a creative person, and you're the one who fulfilled that.
Yeah, that definitely added insult to injury, I think. And to what you said before, I think there's so much power and agency in being able to put language to things, like having the words even to use to have the conversation, right? Like whether it's coming from a book or from listening to a podcast or from a group of women where other people are saying, well, it's this, it shouldn't be this, it's actually this other thing. And what if we call it this? And what if we make the invisible visible? And
Yes.
how does all this work? And my hope, honestly, for You Could Make This Place Beautiful is that it might do for other women in particular what reading certain memoirs did for me, which was give me language, give me permission, give me courage to say some things that were hard to say publicly, right? Writing about one's life is not easy.
Yeah. No, this was definitely on the heavy, heavy side. The framework that you used, the way that you structured it, and you had certain very short chapters, even like a couple of sentences, and you used a technique that I thought was fascinating. Another way you ramp in was one of the many was Google Maps.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was an essay actually. The chapter in the memoir about Google Maps started out as a modern love essay. It was published in the Times, actually before I even got divorced. And so I pulled that in to the memoir and then wrote a follow-up chapter discussing the edits that my now ex-husband wanted to impose upon that piece before it ran in the Times. And when I got those edits, I thought I had no idea I was going to write a memoir at that point, but I definitely thought I would love to be able to write about this. It feels very meta, but how do you write about someone trying to like effectively censor your writing about your life, which is a specific kind of grief, really, not to be able to tell, right? That's its own injury, is everything has happened and I can't say what is happening. It's just another layer to the whole thing. So I knew fairly early on, as soon as I decided, okay, I'm going to write a memoir, I knew that those two things would happen in the book, that I would share that story again, and then I would talk about the aftermath um, of what was going on with that piece. And part of what I did in the book is try to think of what questions skeptical readers or even judgmental readers might have about me sharing some of the things and disclosing some of the things that I disclose. And I thought, well, what if I kind of nip that in the bud and head it off at the pass and just write the answers to these questions in the book itself? Maybe then I won't get these questions later. I still got the questions.
Well,
But I could at least say, I wrote about this on page X, and it's interesting that you're asking because I already kind of covered this, so we could just go back to that page and I could read you what I wrote about it.
I mean, you talk about privacy in the book, and it's sort of like you're telling your story as much as you're comfortable revealing. And you don't have to. I mean, something I teach is you don't have to reveal everything,
Nope.
just important things for you to get across the point that you want to get across, which is what you achieved. And of course, there's always going to be people who want to know every down and dirty detail. And that's not the book that you wrote. You wrote enough of I mean, there's plenty of dirty I think there is, but
Yeah.
particularly from the
Yeah.
other side. And also your own feeling of shame and unworthiness. I mean, every time I read, like I cried, like you cried so much in this book.
I
And I'm
did.
just like feeling for you. And I'm feeling, where is the person telling her that she can have agency? Like you were climbing a mountain to get to that realization that you deserve, because you were making yourself small to fit somebody else's idea of what and who you should be. And you are very big.
We do that though, don't we? Like I think sometimes in large ways, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in our personal lives, sometimes in our professional lives. I do think it's gendered. I think women do it more than men. And it's what that sort of cultural expectation about caretaking and making nice and making other people comfortable and not taking too much space and not being too loud or overbearing. And the same behavior in women is called one thing, and that same behavior in men is called something else. And so, yeah, a lot of the sort of writing of this book was thinking about it as a tell mine, like you said. Like I'm not telling my whole story by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm going to be clear that this is from my point of view. It is not the objective capital T truth. It is
Right.
what happened to me from my limited perspective. There's no omniscient narrator, which is a real bummer because I think most of us could use an omniscient narrator in our lives to tell us all the things we don't know, all of our blind spots, but also just finding a way formally through the structure of the book to do what I wanted to do and also set boundaries.
So I feel like this is pretty fresh. 5 years from now, you may want to write a different kind of memoir because you'll have so much other kind of experience and you'll have the Google Maps view of, 5 years from now. Do you ever think about that? Because you do talk a lot about timeliness in the book, about, this is now, this is how I
Yeah.
feel now. I don't know how I'll feel then.
Right. I mean, I think really every book, whether it's a memoir or not, is a time capsule. It is a record of your thinking about something specific at a specific time. And so if I look at my first book of poems, which, I wrote 20 years ago, I wouldn't write those poems the same way now. And I don't mean just at the sentence level. I'm not the same person in a lot of ways. I see things differently. But I don't feel the need to revise or change those poems because in erasing or changing those choices, I'm kind of erasing that young writer. And so I think about my memoir, and you're right. In 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, I might have a different story to tell or a different version of this story to tell. Or I might look back at it and think, oh, wow. Gosh, I was in so much pain, or it took me a long time to learn lesson X or lesson Y, but it's a time capsule of the person I was during these years with young kids and the
Yeah.
thinking that I did about my life during these years. And my hope is that when I look back on it, I'll think, wow, I've come a long way. That's my hope.
That's beautiful. So, what are some real actionable writing tips? Because there are a lot of people who want to write a memoir. I'm trying to write a memoir, and I finally figured out the structure of how I'm going to do it, which that was huge
That's
because
huge.
huge. Yes, there's a big growing point there. What do you recommend for making your voice the most compelling it could be, and just some of the best advice that you give your students?
Yeah. I mean, I talk to people all the time, even just in signing lines at events, and they'll say, I'm trying to write a memoir and it's so slow going. And I think sometimes people will say, I think it's about this. And I will say, I think that is problem A. Do not think about what your book is about when you're trying to write your book. What your book is about is what you realize when you stand back from the book at the end of the process. And then you realize it's like trying to write the foreword to something before you've written the thing. I don't even title things until I'm like at the very end because I don't know what fits until I've built it. And so if you think you're writing a memoir about your life and you think it's about resilience or generational trauma or whatever the thing is, you might find in the writing of it that it totally takes a completely different twisty turn and leads you into something completely different. But if you think you know better and you know what it's about, you might actually not be willing to follow the road that the book is trying to lead you on. So my advice to those people is like forget what it's about. Like forget the big ideas. just start writing scenes, start writing anecdotes, like start from sense memories. Like try to put us in a room for a difficult conversation. Try to remember where you were when you heard X news. Like, what did you smell? Where were you? What kind of car was it? What was the upholstery? What was playing on the radio? What was the light like? Remember what you can. And if you can't remember, tell us. I can't remember, but it was January. And based on where I live, it was probably like this. And so getting us into your sort of headspace and into setting and into dialogue as much as you can remember, I feel like that is more of a productive avenue because once you start to pile up those scenes and sense memories and impressions, the shape of the thing will start to speak to you. At least that's been my experience.
That's great advice.
Someone said, the longest sustained scenes in your book are mostly about your children. And I thought that means something because I was dipping in and out in sort of more brief bits, I think, with some of the more painful memories. And then the longer extended chapters are really me remembering these beautiful moments with my kids. That's something like, and that's trusting the writing, I think, and not imposing too much on it. Like, I just want to dip into this thing in 2 sentences and then get out and leave you with some white space. But then the story about my child, I can go on for 3 or 4 pages in this book about that.
It's interesting. As you're talking, I'm thinking you're really guiding us through the book. Like there is a
Mm.
lot of control, maybe the control that you didn't feel you could have in your marriage. You put that in the pages of the book because you are taking the reader on the journey you want to take the reader on.
Oh, yes. I actually wrote this book entirely without showing pages to my editor until it was done because I knew I wanted to do it in a certain way and that it was going to be sort of odd. And I didn't want to be deterred at all.
I like
Um,
that. That was the strength that came in out of what you had gone through.
I think in some ways it did. And I think for me, the way the story is told is as important as the story itself. Like the actual quote unquote plot of the memoir cannot be extracted from the form the memoir is in. Like the structure is the content. And part of what I was really trying to do with that, and part of the advice I would give to other writers when kind of coming up with that structure framework is what do you want the reading experience to be for your reader? And so for me, I wanted that sense of the sort of waves of grief to come across. I wanted the sort of circular thinking of rumination to come across. Well, that's why the book is patterned with as much repetition and refrain as it is, because I didn't want to just hand the story to the reader. I wanted to put them in it and have them feel as much of the experience personally as possible. And so finding that sort of psychologically true form for the story, I think is something that can help us get to that sort of right container.
So what would your exit ramp be, to use your words, for the end of this interview?
What is the exit ramp? I suppose I would say that we all have a story in us. Like most of us have many, many stories. And it might not even be the one that is obvious. Like this material handed to me at the end of my marriage felt like very obvious material to write my way into. But some of the things I'm writing about now, which I won't talk about because I don't want to jinx them, are much quieter stories, right? Like I think it doesn't necessarily have to be the worst thing that ever happened to you or something incredibly dramatic. And in fact, if we could only write about our lives around trauma or drama, we would be severely limiting ourselves. And also, we would be severely limited in the kinds of stories we were reading. And so, what excites you, what lights you up, that might be a perfectly reasonable avenue to take in your writing, not just what made you feel bad that you need to process, right? Like, what are you interested in? What would you like to read a book about? What kinds of stories are you not reading that you think, to take Toni Morrison's advice, if the book you want to read doesn't exist, then you must write it. What is that for you? And it may not be a book about the thing you think you want to write about. It might be something else entirely.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Maggie. It's been such a pleasure having you on the program.
Oh no, this was so much fun. Thank you.
Follow me at EstelleSErasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.